with your work shown here at the gallery, Unknown Return, there is this kind of, I guess, blurriness or fluidity between the archival image that looks at your ancestry as someone from Korean descent that ended up in Central Asia under Soviet rule, but also, you know, there's a blurriness between the archival image that you were able to recuperate, sometimes a retouched image, and, you know, mid-journey kind of generating this index of trauma, the Korean deportation of 1937. And I mean, it's a very specific context that we're talking about. And I was wondering if you could tell us first a little bit more about the context, and second, how you were working with images and how you were also correcting some errors that the AI was generating for this kind of history that's not really been very formalized visually.
Yeah, the project dedicated to the Korean diaspora in post-Soviet spaces, and also I belongs to it, and it's something I try to find the way how we can back to the things that we lost. Or things that passed away, but it's difficult. It's almost impossible, like return, and we have to almost always we have to reinvent the ways and approaches how we can return to these things that give us meanings in time, and. Midjourney is just one of the ways how we can imagine, or we can how we can see things, because a lot of things actually invisible, but the why it's invisible, it becomes visible. So this kind of dialectical structure of the image, let's say.
But also the relationship between the past and the future is in the...
Let's say just with time, because time can be like linear, or it can be unlinear, like topology, because it's based on things that, like even with physics, it's also kind of theory of time that can be different of the linear time, let's say. Yeah, and about unknown return, I can just give the example of the unknown return, that we have a kind of traditional cousin, like salad, the Korean salad, but it's based on the carrot, which is actually not exist in Korea, but it's called Korean salad, and it becomes really like something Korean in our community.
Yeah. Speaking of carrots, Fatma has a new research about that, but maybe that's for another time. Minja, I want to go into this idea of language in your work, because a lot of your work grapples between a sense of, let's say, a certain loss of individuality, a certain subjection to a system that is beyond control, and yet you create so many systems in your work. And so I was wondering, where or what is the language in your work, language in the most literal sense of writing? Because a lot of your work is also describe, like a lot of the work that you do comes out through this personal voice that you also describe your work in, but yet the language is somehow absent in your work. I don't know if you'd agree.
Anyway, she was mentioning about kind of individual, like actions or individuality. It's anyway, I'm just really small, one person in this big world, and then I made kind of through kind of learning a lot of different kind of systems in Korea, and also from the world, and from my mom and dad and friends. Anyway, and you know, this is anyway a part of me. So as an individual, I'm kind of one of the person that kind of get through all the systems in the world, in a specific country, especially Korea. And Also, I live my life as an individual every day and kind of repeating my day every day, live one by one. And then as an artist, and I usually think about kind of I'm doing something as kind of my action, and it can be kind of my language, I think. Like, I'm just really small one, and then I think I can do something, and then I just leave, and then the way I live is really individual action in every day, but at the same time, I'm living this big world and this big society, and then I always kind of do something to react and kind of go through this kind of field, this kind of systems. So that's kind of thing.
And a lot of your work is really durational. So there's a work that we don't see in the gallery that's an 11-hour footage of a marathon that Minja did on her own over 2 days. Not a competitive one, obviously, but her idea of a marathon that was documented in footage. We have the photo documentation here, and there's obviously the main work inside the belly of Monster, which took place over 2 years in Belgium, but then continued in Seoul with this amassing and arranging of excess, of residues, of food items, of really measuring what you consume and looking at your own individual lens in relation to structures of consumption, I guess, larger structures. But this idea of timing and measurement and duration leads me to Mona's work, where it's really like a fraction of a second of something that you measure very precisely, but then kind of draw out in multiplicity in your work. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about Trampoline, which for me is like, it's a video, it's a material, it's a textile, it's so many different things in its form. And if you could just explain the background of how you stitched it together.
Well, with Trampoline comes from a bigger series called 1, 2, 3, 4, where I was extracting, again, very small clips, usually a second or under, of gestures of athletes, usually international sporting events, and shaving off time so that they seamlessly loop. With Trampoline, it was a little bit different. I was really interested in the trampoline itself, not the figure. So I noticed that as the figure was on the trampoline and the weight of the body was pushing on the trampoline, you could see the springs, you could see the pink fleshiness underneath, which just happened to be the color palette of the London Olympics at the time, which is where I got this footage from. And I saw it as it was alive, it was breathing, and so I would take out every clip where different athletes were on the trampoline and it was positioned with a bird's eye view so that they were all as seamless as possible, and you know, put them together to make this work.
Yeah, and it really has that like a different kind of materiality. I mean, not digital is material, but like kind of stretched out like textile in a way, looking at that work from above. And Fatma, last but not least, and we're still going to go through. So a lot of the work here has the body absent or present, but in very different ways. But most of the time it's actually the gesture comes from the body but ends up somewhere else. And I was wondering how you see the body in relation to time and repetition in your own work, in your daily practice, in your sculptural practice, in your research-driven work as well, because there is this iterative sense that you share with some of the artists in the show.
For this work, the bricks, I created a mold for each individual brick, and I kept on being very specific with the measurement and timing and quantity with using the chemicals and materials that I would pour inside the mold. But what I found interesting about it was how every time that I would create it, sometimes it would come out very strong and rigid, and other times it would almost collapse on itself. And it just made me question the idea of a mold itself and how it can, like, you expect it to create things unified and to be continuous in its way, but if a mistake happens, like, how do you react to it? And for me specifically, I was very happy with that. It was a very happy surprise, and it felt like it added a lot to the concept and the idea that I was talking about, which is societal structures and like the brick as a metaphor to the self, and like how many skins or shapes do we put on to be present in different societies and different places.
Thank you. And I was wondering if I could just pose a question to anyone who wanted to answer. What interests you in the everyday as a source of study and a source of practice? Because I know for example, you began with this idea of boredom, right? And created artwork out of boredom. So maybe you could tell us a bit more about that.
I think I have a background in photography, and when you're training in photography, you're taking photos. Usually, it's a starting point with looking at the everyday and what you can highlight from it, and it probably was where I started having an interest in it. When it comes to boredom, that I think came along with working with video. I was concerned initially how, moving from a still image to a moving image, where then I had to think about the attention of the audience, and I didn't know how else to do it then, except the fact that my work is slow and can be considered boring, and I like that. I think boredom is challenging. I think it's hard to stay bored and push yourself to stay in that to sit in it, but what happens when you do end up focusing and then not focusing and focusing and refocusing. We've all been in situations where you're sitting somewhere and you can't leave, and so then you're struggling with a situation of I want to leave or I'm bored, and how you can learn to find something appealing within the environment that you're in. And I was thinking about that as something to really lean into and to embrace within my work. And I think there's something actually that about the everyday, about routine, about how life passes by, that boredom is actually really beautiful in that sense.
It's interesting because you only extract a little bit of that in a sense, right? It's like with the trampoline, it's like before the movement. But it didn't have to do with boredom, but it's before something happens, in a sense. And Minja, I wanted to ask you, we've spoken about this before, but what is it that causes you to, or drives you to arrange and collect 382 different types of food items, or, bottle caps, or everything, that we kind of use over years, and then also continue to work on that practice, like as a subject of study? Where do you think that comes from?
Actually, I got asked the question quite a lot.
I bet you did.
Yeah. And so actually I was a little bit thinking, why I am kind of not throwing lots of things away, and why I kind of just leave it dry, or I just kind of collecting, not really collecting, but kind of collecting, and happen to be collections of something. And there is just I can think of few reasons, and then one is I just like to see them kind of drying and changing its shapes and changing colors, and it's kind of piling up and almost I can say invading all my spaces. And I kind of like to see, and at some point if that collection grows and grows and it makes my behavior changes, I need to make some kind of spaces to just walk in my house. And I like to, actually it's a little bit annoying sometimes because it's a lot, but I can see some things that I already eaten. And then I also thought about another kind of things. It's because of my grandma, I think. Actually, my grandmother passed away like more than 10 years ago, and she lived with me, my family. And then when I was young, and I always see my grandmother collects plastic bags and few of the like papers and things, because when my grandmother, she was born in 1919, and then when she was young and when she was most of her life, the materials are just rare, like that kind of things. And then she didn't throw away that kind of things because at some point it is needed to use again and again and again. And then, so she also
What kind of materials?
mostly kind of plastic bags and like some of the fabrics and some of the like plastic packages. Yeah, to use it again. And actually it's also related to something we need in a daily life, that kind of things. So maybe I learned it from her, or maybe I just kind of naturally, I not naturally, maybe just happen to be like this kind of person.
But you started with a painting practice, like a traditional painting practice.
Yes.
Okay, we can investigate this further. It's going to take time, I think. Yeah, I guess my question to Khalid is, what is the is there a residual form? What is the gesture? What does the gesture leave behind in your work? Like, what are you leaving behind? You're leaving receipts, you're leaving printouts, but that is not necessarily the work, right?
It's like the practice always started out within itself as a game. Not to sound concerning, but like when you're unhappy with your routine or the routine or everyday life, I would come up with these games somehow, and the games would somehow, they're more just self-manifestations or self-projections, but it would give a reason to participate in the next day, and that became very entertaining. I don't know, like my older works, Dubizzle, where it was a series of oil pastel drawings of classified ads. But in that classified ads, I was projecting a dream life, like, ooh, this home, this car. And that's how I started like producing multiple drawings every day. And then...
But isn't it boring to copy something and draw it out? Or is it soothing for you? Like,
it is soothing because I'm somehow gaining a sense of control now, a sense of authorship in a life that didn't have much authorship of my own.
By copying it exactly how it is.
Precisely, right? And then you tweak certain details. Like I used to draw this is called receipts number 2, but receipts number 1 was actually copying receipts quite photorealistically. Like it would emulate exactly what the receipt looked like, but I would tweak certain details. So a parking fine to my mother's car is now a parking fine to my hypothetical car, and now that becomes a relic within the everyday that I can believe that this happens.
There's an intervention, but it's not always legible, right?
Yeah, and I kind of like those become traces now in the everyday. So I guess I'm like one step ahead and one step behind, which is setting up the mundane and then expecting a result. Yeah.
And moving back to the carrots, so a lot of your work looks at analogies between, what you're looking at, let's say the brick, the carrot, and a larger structure, a social structure, a colonial structure. So I'm wondering how your focusing on, like, you're commenting on something larger. Do you start with that and then decide, or does the material or the object or the research lead you to, like, how is your process functioning?
As I mentioned, I'm a process-based artist, so while creating, things keep on revealing themselves to me. So for the carrots, for instance, which is not presented here, but it's a previous work, I was basically mostly looking at archival documents, and I came across a document that was talking about carrots and like how the British colonialism basically wiped it off from the Gulf region. They wiped the purple carrot, which was the native carrot around. I'm thinking mostly into things that are unseen and that you wouldn't really expect it from the first glance. So things that are very mundane, very you can like walk past it and like not give it really attention to it. Same with the brick itself. You see walls as a structure. You see houses as a full structure that is supposed to house and protect and be a home. But what happens when that specific smaller unit is not really viable, it's not really strong enough, it started collapsing on itself? How will that react into the bigger scheme of the structure itself?
It's like a very ordered, somehow, way of looking at the world, but with the little imperfections in the actual work itself.
And I prefer it to be kind of playful, so they do have heavier concepts behind them, but when you see the work itself, you wouldn't really guess it from the first glance. But as you spend more time with it, it starts revealing itself more and more to you.
Also, there's a little bit of pain in the process because sometimes they don't hold up. The structure collapses, right? But the point being, I think, obviously, is not to force that collapse, even if you're talking about it, right? To let it go, right?
Just for it to happen naturally. I don't wait for it to happen, but when it happens, I accept it with open arms.
And Sasha, I wanted to ask you about your interventions in the image, which are actually quite difficult for me to grasp as a non-artist, but like, especially what you did with Gaptonum and what you do with Camera Obscura. And you're intervening in the image that's out there in the world and creating, I guess, all these mirrors. I think you wrote it beautifully, like the sky and the earth, and then, of course, the history of the image that you actually pictured in the gallery here is that it's an apple orchard that's been cleared for a construction site. There are migrant workers from Korea, so there's always that historical kind of heavier element to it. But the image itself is not documentary. And so, or maybe that's problematic to say.
It's a kind of bridge to the some meanings, but for me, most important that can we document or memorize things in different ways, because usually it's colonized or captured by power or by language, and I try to make this kind of density of traces that has traces that still have some kind of connection with their object, that with the indexality, this kind of why? Because we don't know what we need in future, and then we can because we don't know what happened in the future. So that's why it's important, this density of different type of traces and things, and also they are kind of have resistance potentiality, a resistance against a resistance to the language.
But what is the physical process like of creating that slice of the apple orchard that you've I want to know how it actually works physically.
Physically, it's a very simple construction. As you see, it's just a cube, camera obscura with the 6 focusing holes. That's north, south, east, and sky and earth, and there are kind of topological figure inside, also covered by the photosensitive material, and then it becomes like more like noisy than some certain things, and it's important. And I like that it's kind of difficult to catch by the ideology, for instance, because and there are kind of, I like the idea of that the line is not that depicted things, it's kind of gap between things that or the end and between the something that just started. It's space, it's not just flatness or something.
And you can almost see the gap in the image, right, in the center.
Yeah, and also you can see the medium, because this is focusing also as emptiness by itself, but without this emptiness there are no focusing in optical medium that's not working without this emptiness.
And I want to move to Mona, and I guess what I see, kind of intervention in time, but also in multiplicity, and you have the 3-channel video, each doing a different thing, of a different, like same action, but like very different thing. An apple that cannot be grasped, a hand kind of reaching out to it, and then you eating the apple. And then, downstairs there's more of a disrupted image or multiplied forms. And I was wondering, like, how do you see your intervention or your gesture in these kinds of videos and photographies that you used to take on board? Like, is it in this iterative work? Is it more distortive? Like, how are you approaching the final work?
I see my hand in the work a lot. I see that, I take the video clips and I find that I'm like the shaving of each clip, seeing how they can work together seamlessly. It's not something that one might notice right away, but there's a lot of care and attention to it to look as seamless as possible. I've worked with 3-channel videos before, and I like the relationship of, like, I like having videos where they have some sort of relationship with each other. And I think sometimes what happens is that then one video is faster or slower or more responsive to something that it is sitting next to. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question exactly, but I'm just gonna keep going. With trampoline, I was drawn to the idea of, when the body was on the trampoline, there was this sort of like pixelation that was happening with the texture.
I guess there's a certain choreography that you're kind of doing, right?
There is.
Like editing.
There is. I would call, I don't know, I guess that's a good word. Yeah, there is just directing at large, where I'm just...
Especially now with your new work, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, I play a lot with repetition, and there is this, I look for it to become memorization, so that the audience is then, once they memorize that the work, they know that nothing is really going to change, then they are free to look around the work and to look at details that they may have missed as they're watching, like, the bigger gestures. And those details could be the background, it could be lighting, it could be sometimes smaller other movements that are happening that might even be a tell that something was manipulated, like that time has been manipulated. So that's how I feel like my hand is involved.
And in terms of memorization, I guess the only really literal moving work in terms of like visually moving work is Sasha's more than 100,000 times. I also would like to know more about the process of that. Did you direct it? What was the choreography? How, like, did the subjects of the work who are performing the motions, did they enter their own different states as they were just performing the same motion over and over again? Also, if you could give us context about which factories, where they were,
Yeah, it's mostly migrant workers in Korea. There are no choreography. They show their real movement during the day, doing their job. And usually it's like working days about 12 hours, and the repetition is like about a few thousand times per day. So it's like, and it's we and I was working on the factor at that time. That's why I started thinking, because this repetition gives some kind of very how to say, very strange feeling of mind when you repeat something many times, like more than 100,000 times. You understand something, and it becomes this movement becomes kind of mantra or kind of meditation. And it's weird because it's kind of alienation, like pure Marxism, kind of depicted like very precisely. But at the same time, there are something invisible that can give another meanings, and can we before we talked about boredom. So it's kind of, I agree that it could be a kind of different type of the boredom.
Yeah, but also you remove the machine, right? So the machine, or whatever it was that whatever actions they were performing, minus what they were performing on in your film. Like, let's say they're doing something in an assembly line. The assembly line is not there. Like the object that they are using to perform is absent.
Yeah. It's just because I want to highlight this invisible part of the life, because when it's on the factor, it's kind of too obvious.
But were they all with you? And how did you did you choose people who are with you or different factories?
Different factories. Yeah,
okay.
There are in the end, in subtitles, there are in the end of the titles, there are all information about what they are doing, where from they are, and yeah.
And they could just do it with their eyes closed, right? It was just like ingrained, like mindless action.
Yeah, it's termed like a floating mind. It's by Alexander Ugay, who invented this the theory of improving how to make the labor more effective. Then it was sketched by Japanese, and then it goes to the Korea, and to kind of, you have to do just things without any just do something with few movements, kind of optimization of the labor. Right. That's the word I just
Productivity.
Yeah.
I'd like to end with the opening, the work that you first see when you enter the exhibition, which is from Minja's Frozen series. And in a way, it's interesting because a lot of the other works are, let's say, the actual residues. You're using the actual banana skins or the boiled potato peels, and in a way, those will decay over time or they dry up, right? But in a sense, this is the most preserved work, even though it was the most ephemeral actual source, right? Because they're ice sculptures that you made. There's persimmon seeds, apricot seeds, lemons, tea bags, that temporarily were made into ice sculptures through silicone molds. But yet, in a way, it's the work that will not decay because it's not the actual material, right? So it's just interesting that I'm wondering how that actually work came to be, because it really is ephemeral, whereas some of the other works you really try to preserve the essence or what was left over,
That work, actually, I just kind of think of the image of it, like not really at first moment, not really think a lot about kind of like concept or like meanings or things. I just kind of suddenly think about some images that kind of small things kind of in the ice freezer, and then with the ice as ice, that kind of images, and then also kind of maybe we a little bit talk about kind of repetition and like in everyday lives, and then kind of I'm not the person who is really do something repeating and became like master kind of things, like because I kind of think that when I was young I learned piano for long, since I was 5 to almost like 14. But actually, I really hate that kind of repetitional like things every day, because my piano teacher always kind of made circles that for I'm practicing one songs and then I can just check. And mostly I didn't do that, and I don't really practice. It means I really hate that kind of like repeating things. So I was keep thinking about kind of Sasha's work, Alexander's work, kind of what kind of things I have done in like more than 1,000 times in my life, and anyway we all anyway human, and then I'm kind of eating, and then I leave things drying, and then I like to see because it's really beautiful. Like it became drying, and then the color changes, and it's really beautiful, and I like to. Maybe that's kind of one reason that I kind of first keeping them, not throwing them away. And then I'm doing anyway, kind of repeating that kind of action every day. And
in this case, I wanted the sculptures, and you said no.
Yeah. And then yeah.
That's
and,
not the material. It's
Yes. And anyway, I was also thinking at the same time the other ways. And the ice is gonna be just really stays in like with that specific forms, because it's really small and delicate, and then it only stays like 3-4 minutes, and then it's kind of start to like melting, and then I need to take picture in the 3 to 5 minutes, and then anyway I also keep thinking that maybe I'd like to see that all sculpture really full of the really big freezer, like as the same size as my house, kind of thing. but anyway, at some point of my life, maybe I can do that. If I can have really, really big freezer in
So you're
home.
just trying to house things. Maybe. Maybe it's not important. Maybe why is not the issue. But I'm just so curious about, the obsessive.
A little bit also related to kind of keeping some things like fresh. And also
Before they disappear. But some you can see them starting to melt. I get the detail is quite phenomenal. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here with us today. I want to pose one last one. Is there a work that you would never show, and why? A work that you've made that you would never ever show to anyone? The answer could be no, but hopefully it's not.
the question for us. Yeah. There are a few works I do, but didn't show.
Why? You don't want to show is the question.
No, because I don't. Because some of the works are really related to my everyday life and everyday just behaviors. And then sometimes I'm doing something. I'm really kind of a little bit lazy person, but I'm doing something, and then it is left. And I like that kind of drawing. And then actually, since like 4 or 5 years, like last 4 or 5 years, I felt a little bit of pain around my necks and like back. And then sometimes I made kind of drawing, kind of marking the parts I have pain, and then I literally like the drawing, but I don't think it's drawing.
You say that because you were trained as a painter, I think. Yeah.
Yes, that's also interesting part, because I told you guys that I really hate that kind of repetition. So when I was preparing for the entrance exam for the art school, I went to the kind of preparatory institutions for the entrance exam, like painting and drawings. And I went there like almost every day, like 6 days a week and 4 hours every day. And I never missed for 3 years. And I did that. That's something really interesting. But actually almost like 2 months before the entrance exam, I was kind of really fed up with that kind of like repetitional practice of drawing of the Roman Greek sculptures and still like paintings. And then, but anyway, my mom kind of like turned me kind of down. Just you have only 2 weeks left, and just do it like. And then anyway, like I kind of like I thought I liked painting, but I didn't like painting. but anyway, that kind of paint drawing I never showed.
But your grape. I mean, we could go on for 2 days, you and I. So I'm gonna, your grapes and your tomato paintings don't have repetition in them. Each one is different, but it's not repetitive. It's not also painting something over and over again, or is that not repetition?
It's kind of repetition, but yeah, that's really also weird thing that I kind of like this because actually
We didn't resolve anything.
that kind of way of painting is really exactly the thing that I learned for the entrance exam, preparing the entrance exam. The way to kind of catching the color with the watercolor painting.
Yeah, the dimension.
Yeah, dimensions and like.
It's beautiful. It's a craft.
Yeah.
So, any questions?
Sorry, as someone who's just left the corporate world and trying to dabble with art, I sense like I'm on my own journey to find experiment. And that's why it's more of the question is to help myself. Maybe it will be useful for other people. So the question, I guess, for everyone is the source from which you pull your artistic practice from. So here I see, there's a theme of maybe childhood trauma with the previous lifestyle, boredom, so like for all of us there's a different source. So the question is, is it important to have one single source, or is it okay to have that sort of amalgamation of that sort of chaotic human beings that we are, and every art can come from a different source, and then does that create a problem of inconsistency where the art world doesn't seem to appreciate, so that's kind of like the question is the source from which you pull your art from. Is it a single one, or a sort of plethora? How do you make sure that the work remains consistent if the sources vary?
Thank you. So we have 5 artists. I'm gonna choose. Khalid, could you answer?
I think she'll have a more,
Mona, could you answer? Do you want to?
nurturing response. Okay, I'll take it.
Yeah, and the next question, let's direct it to specific artists. You want to answer? Yeah.
I think it is a source that comes from just living. And so there might be something that you are, looking into at one point. It could be internal, it could be external. And that you can't hold on to it. It will change because you're also forever changing. And so as you yourself and your environment is changing and aging, your interests change and your research changes. Anyone want to add to that?
Oh, it's a beautiful answer.
Thank you.
It's a beautiful breezy night. It was really lovely to have you. Thank you for listening. I hope you learned something, and I learned something.
Thank you.
A lot of things. Let's move inside. Thank you.